Namaste everyone. Welcome to Indic Seminar Series. We have Mohan Sonti today with us. He's an engineer by profession, lives in Boston and very passionate about learning Hindu traditional systems, philosophies, and how they impact our life. Topic today is about evolution of science towards various philosophical systems that our rishis and ancients have produced, and how they impact our life and how they have organized our society over the past several millennia. The methodical thinking and logical process is not limited to science, but the Darshana philosophies goes beyond science, and that's what we are here to appreciate about. Over to you, Mohanji.
Right, namaste everyone. My name is Mohan Sonti, and today's topic is about Darshana. So before we start, we'll start with an invocation of a Sanskrit prayer. Om Sahana Vavatu Sahanau Bhunaktu Sahaviryam Karavavahai Tejasvina Vadhitamastu Mavid Vishavahai. Om Shanti Shanti Shantihi. What that means is, may we all be protected, may we all be nourished, may we work together with great energy, may our study be effective, and let there be no animosity among us. Om, peace, peace, peace. All right, with that thought, the subject presentation today, it's about the acquisition of the correct knowledge. Now, the science is a modern view and methods, and we all are pretty aware of that because we had several years of education on that in schooling as well as in college, and it is pretty ubiquitous and everybody knows about science, and we apparently use it everywhere. But Darshana is an ancient dharmic view and methods. And we're going to see some differences on where the science stands and how we acquire the knowledge, the correct knowledge in the modern age. And Darshana is how our ancient ancestors have done the same. All right, the general objectives are the same for both, but the methods they used and the depth of the knowledge and how they acquired it, there are a lot of differences, and we're going to go over that. So this is about the evolution of science. Eventually, the science will probably have to catch up to the standards set by the Darshana. And we're going to see how I'll give a brief presentation on a couple of slides on what is science. And then we go over the Darshana and we'll see all the different categories and how our ancients have accomplished the same in a much in-depth way and in a much broader way. So the science, the definition, one of the best definitions that I found online comes from a science council. And this is how they define it. They define the science. It is a pursuit and application of knowledge and understanding of the natural and social world following a systematic methodology based on evidence. All right. And the methodology, according to them, this, like I said, this is one of the best definitions I found. It says the objective observation, the measurement and data. And then there's evidence. Then there's experiment and or observation. And then there is induction, reasoning to establish general rules, repetition, critical analysis, verification and testing. So these are some of the components of the methodology. We'll also go with the Miriam Webster dictionary, the definition of science. It says it's a knowledge or a system of knowledge covering general truths or the operation of general laws, especially as obtained and tested through scientific method. Such as the phenomena, such as the natural science. And we also see that it can be applied anywhere. The science itself, like the science of theology, it can be applied in the case of theology as well, according to the dictionary. And then there are a few other definitions in this. You also have the words such as Christian science, and few other definitions for that. And it says the state of knowing, knowledge as distinguished from ignorance or misunderstanding. So this should give you an overview of what is science. And since we all are well versed with it, I won't go into any more details, and we'll dive down into the idea of Darshana. Now, the dharmic scriptures, we're going to see where the Darshana fits into it. The dharmic scriptures, this is not a comprehensive list, but they're classified broadly into 6 layers. The first one is the Vedas, which gives the core knowledge. Darshana, this is where it fits in, where the intellectual understanding of that core knowledge, how we devise different methodologies and tools to understand that core knowledge. Then the Puranas is about the historical events of the past, and they are put up in a very personified way And usually there are multiple narratives that are wrapped into one little story. So those are the Puranas. Then you have the Agamas, which is the procedures. So once we acquire the knowledge, what do we do about it? The procedures set out on that, the rituals and everything that is covered in the Agamas. Itihasa are the examples as they were happening. Itihasa. So the people who wrote these examples were also present while the things were happening. And then the last layer is the Smritis, which are the basic laws and rules governing a system. So in this case, for the dharmic scriptures, this is the very broad 6 layers on how the knowledge is divided. There are many other pieces to it, and we're not going into the details of that. This is just so you understand where the darshana fits in. Now we'll go over the details of the darshana. So before we go over that, there are a few things. Almost all of the description that I give, I have used the Sanskritam words, and then I gave the meaning that I think best suits for our context over here, or one of the best definitions I could think of in English. As we see that none of these is completely, I went through each of those words, and there are actual Sanskritam words that exist for each of the categories. So I used all of them. And this is not a comprehensive list, but it's more like giving a little bit of a glimpse of what the darshana involves. It has a lot more depth. So I'm just skimming through the first couple of layers for each one of those segments and sections. Now, the other thing is, like I said, the science, we have a lot of training on that. We have spent several years on it. Darshana is kind of new to us, to many people. So anyway, so we'll go over the darshana details here. So you appreciate the key is not just to learn everything about darshana, which cannot be accomplished in 40 minutes. The objective is to understand that this kind of a depth does exist, and our ancient ancestors, they have thought through all of these different layers. So in 40 minutes, there is no way we can learn everything about it, but just appreciating the idea on what existed in the past. All right, with that in mind, darshana. So how did they approach the knowledge? So knowledge, or the cognition, is of 2 kinds. So first they divided them into prama, or the valid knowledge or cognition, and aprama, or the invalid knowledge, such as delusions, magic, illusion. All of them are also categorized well, and they're understood. The phenomena behind it is well understood and well categorized. But prama is about the valid knowledge. Now, each of this cognition it requires 3 elements. The first thing is, first we have to ascertain the subject of knowledge. What are we acquiring the knowledge about? That is pramata. And then the object of the knowledge, the knowable. What are we trying to acquire the knowledge about? That is prameya. So who is acquiring the knowledge? What are we acquiring about? And then we have the pramana, the means of acquiring the knowledge. So our major focus is going to be on the pramana. Each one of these has multiple categories. The prama, aprama, all of these has multiple categories. In our segment, we are going to talk about not the different types of subjects. There are categories for that, the object or the knowable. We are focusing on the pramana, the means of acquiring the knowledge. Now, what are the different sections for the darshana? The pramana, there are 6 means of acquiring the knowledge, 6 ways we can acquire the knowledge. The first is called Pratyaksha pramana, or the perception, how we perceive things. Then the Anumana, which is the inferential knowledge. We infer things based on what we perceive. The third is Shabda pramana, the testimonial knowledge, like somebody has seen it and they told you, a very reliable person, and we acquire the knowledge based on that. Then is Upamana, or analogy. Then Arthapati, which is an implication. And the 6th one is Anupalabdhi, so unavailability. Now, Anupalabdhi is when you don't know and you know that you don't know. That is Anupalabdhi, is also a valid knowledge. Something, do you know how this works? I don't know, but you know that you don't know, is also a valid knowledge. So these are the 6 means of acquiring a knowledge. Further, what they did was, there is another way of grouping them. The outlook of the universe, the infinitesimal substance to the infinite universe, we can see them in 3 different ways. Either we can see them as one single unified Brahman, a cosmic entity, as if everything is one single unified entity called Brahman. Or we can see them as a constant struggle between two dualistic systems like Prakrit and Purush. Like, for example, we see the positive, negative, North Pole, South Pole, and so on. It's basically some metastable condition between two opposing forces. The whole universe is made up of two opposing forces. That is your Prakrit and Purush, another way of looking at it. The third way of looking at it is the whole universe is made up of Paramanu, or the infinitesimally small little teeny particles. And they all coexist on their own, but they coexist together. But each individual one is to their own. So there are three ways of looking at it. They're not necessarily in conflict with each other, but they almost complement each other because we can view it in any number of ways, any of these three ways, and all of them are valid. Then the emphasis of the knowledge. Some people argue that a knowledge is valid only if it is practical and applied knowledge. But some say the generic and abstract nature of knowledge, which has no practical value, is still a knowledge nevertheless. That is also an important knowledge. Based on these three categorizations, there are many more, but based on these three categorizations, we have 7 different darshanas, 6 of which are more popularly known as the Shad Darshana, the 6 darshanas. But there are 7 of them, and we're going to go over each one of them. Vedanta, which is the author is the Badrayana, in that philosophy, they accept all the 6 pramana, Pratyaksha, Anumana, Shabda, Upamana, Arthapatti, and Anuplabdhi. Their universal outlook is that of a unified Brahman. The emphasis is that its generic and abstract knowledge is acceptable form of knowledge. Vedanta says a knowledge that cannot be applied and it has no immediate value is still a knowledge nevertheless. And they accept that. Whereas the Mimamsa school only goes with the practical applicability. It does not accept a knowledge that has no immediate practical application. Now, what is an Astika and Nastika? Asti and Na Asti is, as we will see later, the Shabda, testimonial knowledge. Some consider the testimonial knowledge to be fallible. Like I heard somebody say it, they could be lying, or maybe they misconstrued things. So Asti is any philosophy that accepts Shabda Pramana, or the testimonial knowledge, as a valid knowledge is called Astika. And one that does not accept is called Nastika, Na Asti. Now, in the later days, in the most recent past, maybe a few centuries ago, we don't have an idea of theism and atheism. Those are purely the other concepts. And people often use the word Astika and Nastika for theism and atheism, but those are just borrowed words, and it has absolutely nothing to do with the Astika and Nastika here, because we do not have the concept or the idea of theism and atheism. So as we see here, Astika is whether a testimonial knowledge is valid knowledge or it is considered fallible knowledge and unacceptable. That is what Astika and Nastika is about. The other 5 are Sankhya philosophy by sage Kapila. It says only Pratyaksha Pramana, or perception, inference, and testimonial knowledge are the only valid knowledge. Everything else is fallible and invalid. And they have a view, along with the yoga by sage Patanjali, they have a view of the dualistic. They see everything as 2 opposing forces being in a stable form or a metastable condition called the Prakrit and Purush. Those are also Astika. The Sankhya is for the generic and abstract. Yoga is a practical applicability. Now, the other 2 philosophies that are usually talked about in pairs is Nyaya and Vaisheshika by Akshapada Gautama and Kannada. As we see for Vaisheshika, perception and inference is the only source of knowledge. Often when we talk about the physics and chemistry, or as some people call it as the pure science, which is often confusing because I don't know of any other type of science. So in pure science, they say only perception inference is the only source of knowledge, such as Einstein said so is not necessarily a valid knowledge. We should be able to reproduce the experiment, right? So Vaisheshika philosophy by sage Kannada is perhaps closest to the pure science that we often use today. The Nyaya philosophy, as we can see from the word itself, the perception, inference, testimony, and analogy are the valid sources of knowledge. This is often used, for example, in the courts or for the other kinds of logic where you need to make a judgment, right? The last one is Charvaka. It says perception is the only source of knowledge. Everything else is fallible. What you perceive is the only truth. And that is often categorized as Nastika. As we see, for Vaisheshika is actually Nastika. It does not accept testimonial knowledge, but is often categorized because of its close association with Nyaya philosophy. It is often called as an Astika. The next one is, we're going to go into the details of, we have seen the 6 means of acquiring the knowledge. We're going to go a little more in depth about each one of them, on how our ancients viewed these 6 means of acquiring the knowledge. The first one is called the Pratyaksha, or the perception, Pratyaksha Pramana. And there are several ways to classify them. So far we have come up with the most basic structure. So we understood what is science. Then we went to the Darshana, where it fits into the Dharmic scriptures. Then for the Darshana, we saw that there are 6 means of acquiring the knowledge. There is valid, invalid, prama, aprama. Then we saw there are 3 things we need to understand: the subject of knowledge, who is acquiring the knowledge, and how they're acquiring it, the means. The means, there are 6 of them: the perception, inference, analogy, and all of that. And now we are going to go into the depth of what is a perception. Now, in the common jargon, we hear that perceptions vary, but it's not necessarily the perceptions vary. Some perceptions are personal, they vary, and some perceptions are generic, they don't vary. It is often the inferences that vary. And we'll see how our ancients were thinking about what is a perception. One way to classify the perception is, it's called Anubhava Pratyaksha and Smriti Pratyaksha. Anubhava is direct experienced perception. Smriti is what is remembered, retrieved, or processed perception. So when we see certain things, it is direct experience. And then what we experience, we're going to process it and understand it. The same experience we understand in our own way. So we can classify a perception into what we have directly experienced. We can write that down as our experiments or how we perceive things, the perception part. Or we can say how we understood that from what we have seen or done, right? That is smritya. The other way of classifying is nirvikalpa pratyaksha and savikalpa. So nirvikalpa is indiscriminate perception. You haven't processed it, very similar to anubhava. It has no qualities. It is as things come to us. Then there is a discriminate perception, which is with qualities. So for example, now I see a fire, I put my finger in the fire, it is hot. It is indiscriminate. My skin senses it as fire. Now it burns, it hurts. That is discriminate. That's how I sense it, I perceive it. That is smritya. And now I know that the fire burns. That is smritya. We understood that and we know that. And we perceive that it hurts. That the fire is hot is something that we have processed. That's a processed information. But what we experience directly, that is the Anubhava Pratyaksha. And Nirvikalpa, it has no particular order. It just accepts, it's completely indiscriminate. So we see how we can categorize them. Now we go a little deeper. There's a third way of classification, which very lightly touches upon these 2 classifications. So there is a third method where which is the Anubhava Pratyaksha and Nirvikalpa. There are many categories, but roughly matching up with the third method. One is Indriya Pratyaksha, which is a sensory perception. They come under Anubhava and Nirvikalpa. Right? Most of the subcategories, we're going to go over the details of what is Indriya, what is Manas, Swavedana, and Yoga. So this is the 4th way of classifying, which is sensory perception, mental perception, self-conscious perception, and intuitional. All right. The Indriya Pratyaksha, the sensory perception, many of those subcategories is very closely associated with the Anubhava as we experience it, and Nirvikalpa, indiscriminate. It is things as they happen. But not everything in Indriya is Anubhava and Nirvikalpa. Some of them are in Smritya and Savikalpa, as in things that we retrieve and things that we organize in our mind and understand it. Right? But just to give a rough analogy for the third classification method, I just mentioned the Indriya Pratyaksha under Anubhava and Nirvikalpa. The other 3 are more of the Smritya and Savikalpa, the mental perception, the self-conscious, and the intuitional. We're going to go over the details of each one of them, on how many more subcategories exist for each one of them. Indrapratyaksha Pramana, which is the sensory. One category in that is the bodily, tanmatra, which is shabda, sound, sparsha, rupa, rasa, and gandha. Sound, touch, form or sight, taste, and smell. All of us are pretty well aware about these five. We think these are the five very standard ways of perceiving because these are sensory perceptions. But our ancients have divided the Indrapratyaksha into further categories. It can be done in multiple ways, and I'm presenting a few of them. One way of doing it is tanmatra. The second is called the karmendriya, the action-oriented, which is the vak, pani, pada, upastha, and payu, the speech, hand, foot, procreational, and the excretory organs. These are the ones that do an action, and we get some acquired knowledge based on those. The third category is called jnanendriya, which is the wisdom based. So as you see, the organs, the srotra, tvak, chakshu, jihva, and grana, which is the ear, skin, eyes, tongue, and nose. These are the organs. So if you look at the perception, people say the perceptions, there are five sensory perceptions. But the way our ancients see it, there are five sensory organs which take the nirvikalpa or anubhava. It perceives things directly. Then we process it in the mind. And then that is a secondary perception, right? That is a smritya or savikalpa. So we can see the Indrapratyaksha alone can be divided into at least three different groups. There are many more, but I have presented three of them and each having five subcategories. All right. The tanmatra, karmendriya, and jnanendriya. All right. The bodily, the wisdom based, and then the action based. Manas pratyaksha. Manas is the mind. Now, what are the different things that we perceive in the manas? Now, there are three types in that. One is chinta, the thoughts, is a perception too. We haven't inferred anything. This is something that we think and that is there. And then skalpana, the imagination. And then prayatna is the volition. We put in voluntary effort. All of these conceived things we can have, they are all working in your mind. Like let us say something has happened, that event is done with, you go back and you still think about it. So what is that perception? That hasn't happened. That's already happened way in the past. Or things that might happen in the future that you can see through and say, all these things are possible. That is imagination, right? You're imagining that all of these are possibilities. And that is a valid knowledge too. And that too is a perception. You haven't inferred anything anywhere. It is things that you perceive. So as you see, perception again has a next layer. The chinta, the thoughts can be based on the actions that have already happened, right? And how we see them. And we are looking at that, or the kalpana, the imagination, or the prayatna, the volition, as in we generate those thoughts. All right. Each one of them, all of these three types, has two components, sukha and dukkha, the pain and pleasure. Let us say an event has happened in the past and that really hurt your feelings. Or we went to some big festival and we really were very happy. The event was already done. When you think about it, either it generates a pain or a pleasure, and that too is a valid perception. All right. Now, obviously, there's no way to measure it. That event is not happening. It is not present. It has already happened, but we still have a perception of that, the sukha and dukkha, the pain and pleasure. And that perception comes from either the chinta, the thoughts, imagination, kalpana, or through our own volition, the prayatna, through our effort to reconstruct things. All right. So as you see, all of these come under the manasa pratyaksha pramana, or the perception. So now we have seen that the perception alone, what we thought are five sensory perceptions, we saw that sensory is not the only perception, and sensory has multiple different categories of five each, and there are many more. We presented three of those here. And then there are three more categories: the mind, manasa pratyaksha, And we see there are 3 types, and each of them again has 2 components each. And we see all of our feelings or anything we feel. When people talk about feelings, they come from the manasa pratyaksha. All right. The things that we haven't deduced yet, we haven't inferred anything. Just the feeling, the direct feelings alone come from these 3 types. And there are 2 components, and it's all an interplay of all of these gives rise to all different kinds of feeling. Right. And when we acquire a knowledge, we need to account for that. Is it anything that we write down as an experiment? Did it come from the chinta? Or was it things that you have directly perceived, indriya, right? Or if it came from the manas, through chinta, kalpana, and then what are the other combinations to it? So now we see how we classify the whole knowledge and how we acquire it, the precision of that knowledge. Then the swavedana, the self-conscious pratyaksha pramana. And there are 7 types to it. This is again a broad category, and each one has many more subcategories. All right. Raga dvesha, the attachments and aversions. Now, if you think about it, what are the attachment and aversions? In a very crude form, people often call it in the modern day as the confirmation bias or a bias. But we could actually account for that. The raga dvesha, the likes and dislikes, if we know how to account for it, and each one has again subcategories, then any of our experimentation and acquisition of knowledge, we can actually clearly define how much of that component is based on my raga, my attachments, or my dvesha, my aversion. So we know the bias is already included in that. Vidya. So somebody who already has some knowledge, obviously conceptualizes things and understands it in a different way. The same thing is perceived a little different from someone who does not have that knowledge. Like, for example, an infant can look at a human and doesn't know that it's a human or an animal because the mind still doesn't know anything. So how do they perceive it? From a person who has already experienced, who knows everything. You take a 10-year-old kid and you take a newborn baby, they could see the same thing, but they perceive things differently. How do they perceive it differently? It is because of the pre-acquired knowledge, which has already been conceptualized. Now, that knowledge also is conceptualized differently by different people. That is the kalpa. So the same knowledge given to multiple people, they are going to conceptualize it, organize those thought processes in their own way, and try to match it with that to acquire the new knowledge. So the same knowledge given to, say, 5 people can formulate and conceptualize in 5 different ways. And the new knowledge that is put in, they're going to see with reference to these 5 preconceived knowledges that they have acquired, right? A pre-way of conceptualizing that knowledge. That is the kalpa. Niyati. Swavedana inherently, that perception inherently understands the order of things. Like A happens, then B happens, then C happens. The sequence of things is inherent to our mind. So we always have a perception based on the sequence of things that happen. Like things happen yesterday, then happen tomorrow, then happen the day after tomorrow. We always have the sequence of things in our mind. So that is inherently understood. So our mind already when it perceives things, it naturally has an ability to understand the order or the sequential of things. When 3 things happen, it knows the first, middle, the last. It inherently has the perception and that knowledge. The next is kala, the timeline. Anytime we perceive things, our self-consciousness, the swavedana, has an inherent understanding of the timeline. That things happened yesterday, you know that things happen in the past and things that could happen in the future, and what is the present. This is an inherent perception that we always carry with us, right? So we always carry with us the raga, the attachments, which is personal to each person. There are many of the raga categories, and some attachments are common and some they vary from person to person. Dvesha, the aversions. Vidya, the pre-acquired knowledge. Niyati, our consciousness always knows the sequence of things. We always perceive the sequence. We inherently know that. Even if somebody who does not know the numbers or any of that knowledge, they can see that things, if 3 things have happened one after the other, it inherently perceives the sequence, right? So we can, when we do the experiments, we can write down the details of the sequence. Kala, the time, we inherently understand time, and kalpa, how we conceptualize each of those concepts. Anything we understand, everyone has their own way of conceptualizing. It is like everybody has their own little library, and they organize their books, their knowledge in their own way. That is kalpa. And then comes the tattva, the reality. There are 24 to 36 different categories in that. And we are not going into the details of this, but it's enough to understand that Swavedana has 7 types and each one has many more subcategories. The Manasa Pratyaksha, the mind sees in 3 different ways, types, and each one has 2 components. And now there are many more subcategories for each one of them and how all of these interplay with each other. All right. Now there are other tattva. Now some of the tattva, 24 to 36 that I mentioned, now some of them were already mentioned before, but there are few others. I'm just giving a smaller list of a few other tattva. One is antakarana, or the inner body origin. Also a perception, how we perceive. It comes from the manas, buddhi, ahankara, and chitta. In psychology, people talk about the ego or the 3 levels of ego. And then the buddhi and manas. But our ancients had actually accounted for this antakarana. When we perceive things, the mind, the intellect, the ahamkara, the ego, and the chitta, all the 4 play a role. And each one of them are going to give a slightly different perception. And we need to account for what is the origin of that perception that a person has. That gives you the better idea on what is the true knowledge. Another section is the prana, the life force. So there are 5 different pranas that we acknowledge, called the prana, apana, vyana, udana, and sumana. Now, it is very interesting that when say, how can there be 5 different life forces? To give you the casual examples that everyone uses here, right? You must have heard about people talking about my heart doesn't agree with it, right? My heart doesn't agree. My mind doesn't like it. Now, the heart and the mind, people often talk about it. That is the prana. Similarly, you see different phrases such as, it doesn't sit well in my stomach. I was sick to the stomach. You know, why would they have these kind of different phrases? Or my blood was boiling when this happened, right? And I choked when something else has happened. When you think about it, all of these expressions is because the life forces, we very categorically define them into 5 categories. And we say these are the 5 different life forces. And if you look at even the normal language that people use, they have all of these phrases which actually cater to these different 5 categories in a very inherent way, right? Because we hear all those phrases. So our ancients have defined the life force having an origin in these 5 locations. And antakarana, inner body origin, has the 4 categories: manas, buddhi, ahankara, and chitta. And then there is a 5 kosha, or the 5 sheets of life, or the pancha kosha, which is the annamaya kosha, pranamaya, manomaya, vijnanamaya, and anandamaya. So even the inner body, you again have 5 different levels. Now the inner body origin is not same as the pancha kosha, but antakarana is one way of grouping it. Pancha kosha has some overlap. It's another way of grouping the different aspects of our life. All right. So annamaya is the food level, to pranamaya, the energy, the vital energy that runs the life. Manomaya is the mind, the wisdom, and the absolute bliss. This gives a brief introduction to the idea of perception. As we see, the modern day people talk about perception. There are basically 5 ways you can perceive, the 5 sensory perceptions. But as we see, our ancients have gone through many different levels, and this is only a basic outlook. I haven't gone into the details. Like I said, many of them have, again, several subsections. This should give you the basic idea on what is a perception in the darshanas that we are talking about. Of the 6 different ways of acquiring knowledge, means first one is Pratyaksha Pramana, the perception. Now we'll briefly go over the Anumana. Anumana is the inferential knowledge. Now we know about inferring things. There are several ways to classify these. The first method is called, we can classify them as Seshavat, Purvavat, or Samanya Drishyam. Seshavat is inferred cause with a known effect. Like, for example, I see the road is wet. I can see it. So it must have rained. That is my inference, right? I haven't seen that, but it must have rained. Purvavat. Now it is raining. I can see from the window, so my road must be wet. So the known cause, and I'm inferring the effect. So that is an inference. So Samanyata Drishyam is basically known or deduced cause with known or deduced effect. It is raining, I see the road is wet. So you know the cause, you know the effect. Or when it rains, the road gets wet. I haven't seen either of them, but I deduce that when it rains, then I can deduce the effect that the road will be wet. Right? Now you see when you say inference, we have different ways of classifying the inferential knowledge too. What is the known effect? Unknown cause, known cause, but unknown effect that we are going to infer, or both are unknown or known, right? The second way of classifying is swa-artha, parartha, and samartha. An inferential knowledge that you infer for yourself, an inferential knowledge that you convey to another person, or inferential knowledge that is for everyone. In some sense, it is like the first person, second person, and the third person, right? It's for me, for you, and for anybody. So that is another way of classifying an inferential knowledge. Now, each one of them, if you look at it, there are several types of processes. So we have seen the classification methods. And in this classification, I have covered only two types of classification. There are many more, but there are several processes of inference as well. And we're going to cover a couple of them. The type one, there are five categories. How do we do the inference? We do a pratigya, a theory or hypothesis. Then comes the hetu, the reasoning, udaharana or drishtanta, example and concomitance, upanaya, which is the reaffirmation, and nigamana or conclusion. So that is one way of doing the inferential knowledge. That is one process. Earlier we had the classification, and each one of them will follow any one of these processes. All right. We covered two different types of classification. There are many more, and we're going to cover two different processes. There are many more different processes. We use these processes within each one of those classifications. So either we can go with the pratigya, hypothesis, then the hetu, reason, udaharana, the drishtanta, the example, upanaya, reaffirmation, conclusion. That's one process. The second type is we can go with jigyasa or exploration. Then samshaya, then we have a doubt. Shakya prapti is evidence of a possibility of clearing the doubt, that we collected enough evidence that yes, there is a solution can probably exist. Then prayojana, we work an experiment to clear the doubt, and samshaya vyadasha, or clearing the doubt. These are different processes that can be applied. So when someone says I've inferred something, we see what category and what is the process used. All of this need to be described as per our ancients, our ancient sages. Now we mentioned hetu, the reason. There are many categories to it, but let us understand the usage components. Every hetu, the reasoning, has what is called as sadhya, or the major component, and a paksha, or the minor component. What is hetu? Hetu is the middle component or an argument that connects the above two. All right. When there is a fire, there is a smoke. So the deduction of fire to smoke, that hetu, the reasoning, the major component, you have a minor component. So when you have a minor component, there is a smoke, there must be a fire. You see, that connection is basically if the road is wet, if there is rain, the road is wet. You have a major and a minor. So we have specific names for sadhya, the major component, paksha, the minor component, and the hetu that connects them. How does it connect them? Again, there are different connection types for the reasoning also. Now remember, there are sadhya, major component, there are different subsections for the component. The minor components, there are different subsections. Hetu is reasoning, and there are multiple types of reasoning. But all of them, what they do is connect the major to the minor component. How do they connect it? It can connect from kevala anvayi, or it connects positively. Kevala vitreki, it connects negatively. Like if it rains, if the road is wet, it rained. That's a positive connection. All right. The road is not wet, it did not rain, is a negative connection. Or anvayi vitreki, both positive. Sorry. So both positively and negatively relates to the sadhya. So the major and minor component can be both positively and negatively correlated. In this example, the simple example, The road is wet means it rained. If it rains, the road is wet. It correlates in both ways. If the road is not wet, it did not rain. So you see, it's positively and negatively. It correlates. The paksha correlates with the sadhya. So you see the idea of the hetu. They went into the details of different types of hetu, which we are not going through here, but many categories. But they understand how there is a major, minor component, how it needs to be connected. What is the connection between the sadhya and paksha? When somebody tries to acquire knowledge, all of these things must be accounted for. All right. Now, the last part is we're going to cover the remaining 4. Now, you understood the first 2, we went through some details. The remaining 4, we'll cover it in a little faster. The Shabda Pramana, testimonial knowledge. The scriptures, the Veda is the testimonial knowledge. Those are considered the absolute testimony of being the truth. That has 4 groups, the Samhita, Brahmana, Aranyaka, and Upanishad. Most of you are aware of this Vedas having these 4 categories. Samhita are the things that are put together, the Hita, good knowledge. Brahmana is when the things are wandering and acquiring the deeper knowledge. Aranyaka is more explorative, and Upanishad is a deeper introspection. Then Upamana is analogy. Now, analogy is a valid source of knowledge, and there are different kinds of it. There are 3 kinds of the Visishta Pinda Jnana. Is called a sadrishya, or the analogy based on similarity, right? So if you say, or the vaidharmya, or dissimilarity, asadharana is peculiarity, right? Now, for example, is tiger like a lion? No, the tiger has stripes. That is peculiar for a tiger. That is asadharana. Sadrishya, similarity. How does a tiger look like? Have you seen a cat? It looks like a cat. It's similar. All right. What is vaidharmya? How does a donkey look like? When I know what an elephant looks like. No, donkey doesn't have a trunk. What else? It is much smaller in size, the dissimilarity. So you see upamana, the analogy, how we give the analogy. There are 3 of these, and there are multiple combinations of those. All right. There are similarly, dissimilar, and many other combinations, right? Or peculiarly similar. So this is the basic categorization for upamana, the analogy. The next one is arthapati, implication. Now, there are 2 kinds of implication. One is shruta, the testimonial knowledge that we acquired, or drishta, or experiential. So there are again 2 types of arthapati. Once again, each one of these have multiple categories. We are just skimming through pretty much the first or the second layer of it. Anupalabdhi is unavailability. What I don't know, I don't know, right? So we have already talked about that before, is anupalabdhi. But interestingly, this too has about 5 different kinds. Karana is a causal condition. Vyapaka is all-pervading. I don't know because this is generally not known to anyone. Swabhava, presence of itself. I don't know because of the situation I am in, right? Karana is a causal condition. That cause does not exist, and therefore I don't know. Right? Viruddha is opposed, and Karya is actionable. So you see, what we don't know, again, is categorized into multiple ways. Now, with all of these together, we see the Darshana. We see the 7 Darshana, with 6 of them are more popular, called the Shad Darshana, the 7th being the Charvaka. From the Vedanta, Badrayana, when people talk about all the different pramanas, the Pratyaksha, we have seen how many categories, Anumana, Shabda, we have seen all the different categories for them, right? Now, as you see, when people talk about Vedanta or Mimamsa, Sankhya, Yoga, these philosophies, when they came up with conclusions, our sages actually when they go through debates, they actually go through all of these categorization. When someone says, I have seen it, I have experimented it, I have reasoned out, the opposing team is going to say, you have seen, or a perception. What type of perception? Tell me of all the 50 different categories and their subcategories and sub-subcategories. How did you perceive it? That gives a lot of information on the validity of the perception. That can be questioned. And then he says, say Anumana, this is how I inferred it. Then there are multiple categories, as we have seen. How did you infer it? How did you get to that point? And you're going to give each one of those categorizations. As you see here, every one of those words, I have used Sanskritam words. None of them are made up, and there's only a small fraction of it. And there are many more subcategories. I had to, in fact, pick the best fit English meaning for these Sanskritam words. But otherwise, this is how things have been done in the past. Now, can you imagine a system where people are going to go through the Darshana philosophy, and that is what we are trained since childhood, and then it'll take several years, like it took for science, will take many years to learn through all of these, and we start reasoning. For example, when we talk about this so-called pure science about physics, chemistry, I'm sure other sciences are pure as well, but this is the pure science. When they talk about physics and chemistry and others, we talk about Vaisheshika. Then we are very clear about Pratyaksha, we are clear about Anumana, and know what Einstein says is not valid unless we can deduce it ourselves. Or we can talk about Nyaya. When we go to any judgment place, like the courts and other places, it is not a scientific thing, it is Nyaya, wherein the perception, inferential knowledge, testimonial knowledge, and analogy being the only four valid sources of means of acquiring the knowledge. Can you imagine how our discussions and how our acquisition of knowledge, where we would stand? In fact, that is where we were forever. So I would say that the idea of science is brilliant, but it has a lot more to be acquired, and it has to eventually get to the standards of the Darshana. And I hope one day we can all see that we can categorize the whole reasoning and everything, and the application goes to the Darshana level. So instead of saying scientifically speaking, we say Vaisheshika speaking, or from based on the Nyaya philosophy, based on Vedanta. So we see all of these things can be applied anywhere. We have seen science can also be applied in theology. So is the case with all of these philosophies. All right. So with this, I would end the session. Any questions?
Fantastic, Mohanji. A lot of details, a lot of phrases, which sort of we use on in everyday life, but we don't know where they fit in this whole framework. Appreciate the talk today. So we have a couple of questions. So we have Raja Kannuri. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mohanji, for the presentation. It was very useful and very informative. I wanted to ask you a question on behalf of the Indic studies. Are you also involved in applying the darshanas to any of the current situations or the current world problems?
So I would say any of the things that we discuss in the world, right? All the experimentation, the data collection, and all of that. Many times I have to talk in the language of science because if I just talk purely in terms of the Sanskritam words, most may not get it, but I do make a little bit of an attempt. The idea is I can tell you how awesome the language Sanskrit is, but if nobody else understands Sanskritam, then I have to speak another language like we're doing right now, right? Likewise, I do try to apply a little bit, but eventually if all of us could understand this, then we could talk the same language and we can apply it everywhere. For all the world scenarios on what is going on in the world scenarios, what are the different experimentations? For example, the vaccines to everything, when they say experiment and it has been tested, we could talk in this kind of a Darshanic language and say, tested, how? How did you know this was right? We can go into the details. Right now, I mean, if all of us can learn it, it just gets better. Otherwise, there's no other way of applying it, right? We can only apply it only if we all can have the same knowledge. But I tried to the extent I could. Does it answer your question?
Yep. Kumarji, please go ahead.
Oh, okay. Thank you. So thank you for the session. So just like I have two queries, two interconnected queries. So my first query is, while we talked about so much of definition and so much of categorization, when it comes to daily life and day-to-day communications and conversations, don't you think that applying all this knowledge into simple communication would lead each and every individual too perplexed and too confused to even take basic decisions of life? Like in case if someone goes and says that, okay, someone has committed a crime or someone has said something bad, we'll get into deciphering this knowledge and putting all these tests and test beyond that. And we won't have a uniform model through which people can communicate. And that in that way, people will not be able to take very simple decisions of their daily life. And why I'm saying this, I'm talking this from a broader context of Hindu Dharma, our Hindu Dharma, that where we see that even for simple things, we have so much of confusion and so much of debates that no one agrees with one another, because we do not have one single unifying codified way of understanding all these lessons. That's one question. And my second correlated question to that is, when it comes to science, so science never says something with complete authority. It says that with a certain degree of certainty, and always leaves a room for improvement as someone goes ahead and works on it, experiments, and improves that. Can we say same to the Vedas, or can we say same to the Darshanas? Is there any scope of improvement? Can we put those tests, the knowledge of Vedas and Darshanas, to test and improve that? Thank you.
All right, to address the first part of the question, will it lead to confusion? So the whole idea is the knowledge is such that it is pretty vast, right? So there are people who can say that all the experimentation, everything that is done in the labs is pretty confusing. Can we make it very simple? The whole design of a car is very, very complicated. Can we go on a bicycle? Yes, because all of us can go on a bicycle instead of having 20 different types of cars, right? Or 100 different types. So the idea of knowledge is such that, is it confusing? Yes, it is confusing, but we don't necessarily have to acquire everything. So why do we have that kind of what you call it as a confusion among all the Hindus? I don't see it as a confusion among Hindus. It is so many different thought processes the way it needs to be, because all of us are unique in our own ways, in our own thinking. So that has to be inherent. We are not creating clones. The other systems which are simplistic are in some sense are like a social cloning, wherein they have narrowed down and eliminated everything and made it into an extremely simplistic way of understanding that everybody can simply follow. That seems okay for the moment, but in general, that is not a right solution for any society. Now, the other aspect is, can we accomplish, for example, somebody goes to court. Do you know how many different laws exist in America? It runs into several hundreds of thousands of different ways of punishing someone. So it isn't simple, it's already complicated. But if we follow these kind of methodologies, we can organize things better. And right now, when you talk about confusion, there is no standardization for science. Because if you go to one place, everybody uses the word scientific and then goes ahead and talks whatever they feel like. If you go to court system, they call it scientific, and some may not even call it scientific, and everybody has their own abstract arguments. And everybody argues, whoever screams the loudest or whoever has whatever better way of positioning themselves wins in the court. We already have issues with that. This is a lot more organized and better methodical system, and it isn't confusing if we learn it. Just as education isn't confusing, our objective is to elevate everyone to a higher educated level. That does not mean everybody can be at the same level, but we still strive our best to educate people to a higher level. And so is the case with this. This is a more complicated system, yes, because it is more evolved system. So it isn't complicated. Just as the technology is more evolved, and because it is confusing to somebody, we don't stop it, right? So we try to elevate the entire society to that level. The second question that you mentioned is about the testing and verifiability and the probabilistic. All of those things are very subjective terms. And as you see, these are more elaborate methods and tools, and what is applicable for science is naturally applicable for the darshanas. Because let us say the science has a very abstractly defined 5 or 10 tools. Here we have something like 100 different tools. But in general, the theory of what is applicable for science, it is only giving a probabilistic, so is darshana in the similar case scenarios. Except when we use 100 tools, the probabilistic and the accuracy is a lot more compared to using only 5 tools, right? And science itself is very abstractly defined. And there are few tools in it, and each one of them, I don't think it's hardly any few of them can get together and agree on one definition for it, for any one of those tools that we use. Here we have a much stronger definitions, much clearer definitions, and we have hundreds of tools that are well used and categorized. So it is the way I see it, we have better tools and better understanding and more organized thought process that will give us better results. So the same idea of accurate answers. It only gives a predictability, something equivalent to that you have mentioned. The predictability just gets better with Darshana. Nobody is saying it's an absolute certainty. Some of them are certain. Some of them, the predictability is a lot more accurate if you have accurate tools, better tools, and more sophisticated tools. I hope that addresses both your questions.
Anandji, please go ahead.
Yes, Namaskar. A great presentation. My question is, I didn't see any place the word belief mentioned. So that makes it completely scientific. And I am amused when the Western scientists also, or those who call themselves scientists in Western or in the Indian or any other perspective, they make statements like, I believe in this or I don't believe that is true. So this being non-belief system, I believe there should not be any confusion at all. Your comments on that. And second question I have is, did you at any point of time translate Nyaya as justice, or I heard it wrong?
All right, so let me address the first question. So when we look at darshanas, unlike, I think there's a lot of misconceptions that are floating around. We do not have, it is not a belief system at all. There's nothing to believe in it. It's all deduction and everything is reasoning, right? And we have seen all the categories. So I never had to use the word belief. The only point that I had to mention is because of the misconception that people have regarding astika and na astika. Asti and na asti is pertaining to the testimonial knowledge being valid or not valid. All right, whether you take a testimony as a valid source of knowledge, such as like in the court system, you can take testimony, somebody's testimony, to be a valid source of knowledge. But when you're doing an experiment in, say, chemistry or physics or deriving equations, somebody's testimony does not mean anything, right? That is your Vaisheshika. So the belief, when people say astika and nastika, it is simply using two Sanskritam words that have been used in the past and using it for an entirely different context for theism and atheism. We do not have the concepts for theism and atheism. Because we don't have that, we do not have words for it. So essentially, we just borrowed a couple of words from the past, which had an entirely different usage, and used it for this, right? So that's what really happened. Otherwise, it's not a belief system. Now for Nyaya, so Nyaya philosophy is like each one of the philosophies can be applied in society in their own ways. For example, the Sankhya philosophy, one of the usage and how it can be applied, the applied knowledge of that was done by Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha, who was also a Sankhya philosopher. His guru was a Sankhya philosopher. So a lot of the Buddhist ideas are derived from the Sankhya philosophy. It's an applied knowledge that he says society can be run based on that knowledge. Similarly, the sections of the Nyaya philosophy based on that, in the past, when somebody gave a judgment, like the current day court system, at that time they had this kind of system, the Nyaya part of is what was used very often for the court systems in those times. Because those are the four categories. If you look at it, the perception, inference, testimony, and analogy is pretty much all that is valid even today in the court system, right? So the unavailability, anuplabdhi, and the other one is not even valid in a court. So even today, it is still these four. But even in the past, they had the same four, and the Nyaya philosophy naturally fit into the court system. In that sense, I mentioned that, I mean, don't take the word Nyaya to be anything to do with the judicial system, but the judicial system, the Nyaya word actually was borrowed from this philosophy. It was the other way around. This philosophy came in first, then they applied it over there. So in that sense, it is a correlation. I hope that addresses the question.
So Mohanji, no more hand, right? So I guess I'll ask the last question. So can this process, since it's so organized and well set, can we use this for decision making, even in management meetings? Process
So
through.
absolutely. So one way to look at it is, see, you have all the tools at your exposure, right? So when we say people are scientific, they're not using every single possible tool. They're not saying, okay, what is my experiment? What is the conclusion? What is the data? We're not going to talk in that sense, because we're going to take only a small portion of the scientific idea and then we use it in our conversational daily language, right? So it is in a similar way. This gives an entire 100 different tools, and whether it's in management or in our philosophies or even in casual conversations, we can take small segments of it and we can use those tools. So that way it's a lot more clearer that we are using this particular tool. We can say my perception based on this tanmatra and based on this, this is how I understood. So that is a lot more clear than I just perceive it this way. Today, that is a valid statement. But now we have a lot more tools, and we can take a small segment of it and use it. It is scalable, basically.
Pankaj, please go ahead.
Hello, Mohan ji, an excellent presentation. Congratulations on that, first of all. And yeah, so I'm a biochemist and I did my PhD, and I went through a process of writing my thesis and all that, and I learned some of the facts that you correlated after a very in-depth analysis of things, and you made it seem very simple and guilt by correlation and so on, and having an idea, validated by multiple sets of experiments and then reaching to a conclusion, it being a more valid form of fact and so on. And the point I want to, my question is, if this philosophy, you have enumerated a lot of processes of, how to reach to a conclusion, darshana philosophy, and why has it not lasted? The test of time is the most important test for something to be valid. Okay, and if we have so many such a huge humongous set of data, why we are now simplifying the society and not applying this method of darshana that you have enumerated? Yeah,
So
that
if
is,
you think about it, right?
I don't
So this is definitely time tested. The one of the first darshana was Sankhya philosophy that dates back to almost 2000 in BC. That's about 4,000 years old. One of the first darshanas. So by then, all of these systems must have been well established. But you have to take into account, for example, in many of the invasions, their entire libraries were built, and the whole society was folded up. There are many villages that were burnt. So can philosophy thrive in that? When things are destroyed, let's say the whole entire library and the house is destroyed, you have to rebuild it from scratch. And we have to pick up the books and start arranging them and build our own library again. So that's why this is a gap. But earlier people used to use it all the time. And this was used all the way until most recently, maybe 1,000 years ago. This was well-known systems. And this is how, when you talk about Sri Adi Shankaracharya or anyone, they all use these kind of tools. But later on, slowly, in the last 1,000 years, with all the struggles, I think a lot of systems were broken down. So people are starting off with very simplistic systems. Imagine if everything is destroyed in this world, in some sort of a dystopic nuclear holocaust. We're going to start off with making fire using a stick, a bunch of sticks, right? We'll start up again from that point. It is in that sense, we have to rebuild it. At least we know these systems existed. Hopefully we can rebuild things faster, but this is exactly how it was, say, 1,000 years ago, and for several thousand years before that, for thousands of years before that. These are well-established systems. So I hope we can rejuvenate it again quickly.
Induji, please go ahead.
Yes, excellent presentation and content. Thank you for sharing. Where can we get more information or study this, either remotely within the US or from India? How can we get more information to study this discipline?
So in my opinion, the best way of studying this discipline is we have the darshanas already available. We already have, there are many sites that give us the original text for the Nyaya Darshana, the Patanjali's Yoga Sutras. All of them are already there. I think that'll be a good starting point. Personally, I would say if Bharat was Sanskritized, if people knew how to read Sanskritam, we can acquire this knowledge much faster in a more accurate way. Otherwise, many of us who try to acquire this knowledge are struggling to convert that to English and then try to see what is the best match and try to understand things. I think there is no better way of understanding it than first learning Sanskritam and then look at the original text and learn it from there. That'll be the best source. Rather than, I've done some translations, as you see, as the Sanskritam words, and I did the English translation. But honestly, those are not accurate translations. Those are the best match translations. And the best way to understand, for example, dharma, the perfect English word for dharma is dharma itself. It is not a religion. It is not righteous. None of those. So how do you understand dharma? By understanding dharma in Sanskritam. So likewise, the sources are available. We have the original texts that are still preserved for Nyaya Darshana, the Vaisheshika, and all of them. I think if we can go with that source, in my opinion, that is the best way, rather than going through somebody else's translations and things like that. That will be the secondary way of doing it. Like I've done a presentation, this is the secondary way of doing it. But going to the original source, I think if we could do it, is the best way of doing it.
Excellent, Mohanji. I think we are people are quite happy with your answers. Your presentation was fantastic. A lot of information, a lot of guidance on what to do next. I appreciate your coming over, presenting this topic to us. Very important topic, and looking forward to hearing again from you on a different one on extension of this topic. Also, thank you everybody for joining, and we'll see you again in the next seminar. Thank you so much.
Namaste. Dhanyavad.